I would just like you each to talk a little bit about what you think about the idea of integrating the databases in the Driftless Area of the 4 states. What that might take, what might be the best way to do it, what are the pros and cons of that, and maybe what obstacles or opportunities you see to do with that. You can kind of generally take that where you'd like, and then we'll then open it up. Who would like to start?
As far as the integration is concerned, I think it allows, more than anything, it allows for insight into others' hydro research, which is kind of what this all revolves around. The techniques for feature detection, I know Calvin's done a ton of work on this, about, kind of sifting out depth and breadth of these features, and really just getting at the refinement of the best technique. And I think that seeing which features lie in which geologic units is extremely important.
Louder, please.
What's that?
Louder, please.
Oh, okay. I think that identifying the characteristics, the general characteristics of which features lie in which geologic units gives you a better idea of what you can expect to see within those units in your own state. At least that's a huge plus for me, not having to go and figure this all out for myself. That's a massive advantage. And it also allows you to see the pitfalls and maybe some of the mistakes others may have made, so that you don't make those mistakes.
Let's go down the line.
I guess one of the difficulties is that each state has approached this in a different manner, and it's kind of grown organically through time, and as new ways of getting the kind of information we're talking about come along, people have access to that sooner or later. So you've got these kind of evolving things going on all at the same time. And there would be some barriers to try to nicely and neatly bring that together. But I think it would have a lot of use. It would have a lot of use. And Steve said something that's very important here. So we kind of represent geological surveys and the geological science, and we're talking about bringing together sinkhole locations across state lines. The geologic unit maps, the bedrock geologic maps we have, aren't necessarily rectified across state lines. And to me, that almost is the step that you would take first before you start laying the sinkhole features down on top of them. And there again, depending on when that work was done, some people will include as a mapping unit all 300 feet of the Galena limestone. Some people would break it out into finer groups. And so those things aren't always going to match up, and the lines aren't always going to match, and so it's always more painful than you want to think. But it's, frankly, from a technical point of view, it's what we really ought to be doing.
When I was looking at the different presentations, I noticed a lot of similarities. I mean, everybody's using LiDAR. Or historic, I'm sorry, can't hear. How's that?
A little louder.
Okay.
We're way back here.
All right, so what I noticed was everybody's using essentially the same techniques and finding very similar things. So there's a lot of similarities across all of the state surveys and all of the research. And Bob brings out a good point that the state lines do pose a problem with the maps. I was reviewing a U.S. Geological Survey Karst map, the new one that came out or is coming out, and they used a geologic map of Illinois that was put out in 1967, and the more recent one was put out in 2005. So there's there's a bit of a difference. And I looked at it and I recognized what it was. I mean, it was just because it's so different, you know. And so the problem is, you know, you're going after the moving target with a lot of these, you know, with the updates and different generations of maps. But yeah, and that certainly is something that needs to be addressed. The other thing is, I think Steve brought out the point of money, you know, as funding, and to really do this right instead of, you know, doing it on, you know, in your free time and saying, okay, well, you know, I have a cousin who has a GIS database thing that he just got for Christmas, you know, and maybe he could put this thing together for us. You know, it's like, yeah, maybe he could, but you know, it actually needs to be something that's funded so that we can actually put people on it to do things that would take probably longer than anybody would care to work on this. You know, people tend to retire, you know, and take, except Bob. And they take, you know, they leave their office, and the guy comes in with the dumpster and says, okay, you know, we don't need any of this, and it's gone. And so this, you know, in the stuff we're doing, we're trying to put it all into some sort of publications and make it accessible for those doing this in the future. And you know, I see that, I see the funding aspect as a potential problem here as far as making this a single database, or even, you know, even the individual states putting out something, because we're doing it on the fly right now. So I think that's it. Done.
So a few things come to mind. I think the first question to ask is when we talk about standardization and integration is why? What are we really going to get out of this? It's one of those things that's kind of almost motherhood and apple pie if you're collecting data. It's like, oh yeah, we want to make this accessible. Well, you know, realistically, why? And that doesn't mean we're not, why I ask that is, usually we're collecting information right now for a purpose, and it's being used to solve and address those purposes. So it is already being used, it's not inaccessible. It takes, as you've noticed, it takes quite a bit of money and time and expertise to put things into a can that might have some longevity. You've got, and as was pointed out, it's a very dynamic field. And one thing that occurred to me, interestingly here, the whole concept of Karst, well, on a technical level may not be debated as much. From a policy and implementation level, I think Bob basically alluded to the fact in Iowa, it's what we call geomorphic kind of categorization. And so we're just looking at the land surface. But really, again, you know, it's much deeper than that. It's what's going on in the rock. How is the water moving from the surface through the rocks and then under the landscape, which is really, on a more technical level, what Karst is. And not all of the states are using that from a policy perspective. So that use of the information is dynamic. The data that we're using to identify and characterize it is evolving. So you've got a very changing field underneath. One of the things I'd like to throw out is maybe discussions like this, if it hasn't been going on, but discussions like this where Karst experts get together and talk about, again, priority fields that they're collecting, and maybe work towards a little bit of standardization of the types of things being collected, but with the recognition that what's relevant in Minnesota isn't necessarily going to be relevant enough to get funded in Illinois nor Iowa. We, as much as we would like to, we haven't been doing a lot of dye tracing tests. Those are very insightful. Again, Minnesota's done a lot. We haven't done much. I don't know what you guys have done, Bob, or Wisconsin. But it's, again, it's, so while I don't think it's a bad idea necessarily, standardization, I think communication and sharing and kind of going from there is probably more powerful and valuable. And then looking to longevity with our data sets is also important, but institutionally. In Illinois, we're not going to get paid. This taxpayers probably wouldn't like us to spend a lot of resources to manage Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa's data, and vice versa. And so, as Sam pointed out, when he retires, what's going to happen with his file cabinet? Well, it doesn't really get dumped necessarily, but things can get lost. And so a file cabinet gets put in a room that it shouldn't be in, and it gets put in the back of that room it shouldn't be in, and it doesn't get seen for 20 years. Digitally, it has that same problem. So again, looking to those issues and the whys, I think maybe would be a good solution as maybe alternatively. And that doesn't alleviate standardization or integration, but it makes it much more task-focused. So.
Okay, well, I'm going to echo a lot of what Don had just commented on in that. All right, so the Minnesota Karst Features Database has basically been a research database. And so what we use it for primarily, or at least what my experience has been, to identify where these sinkholes occur, springs occur, and why. I just want to briefly mention again that that is getting better in terms of elevation data. That we are getting tighter control on the actual stratigraphic position of where these things occur. So from a mapping perspective, a research perspective, that becomes really important to be able to do that. Again, that's all from the research end of things in terms of the database. My experience with databases outside of the Karst Features database is the Minnesota Water Well database. And my second point I want to make is these databases survive and they keep on going. Funding is a big part of it. You also have to have somebody or a group of people involved in that are constantly watchdogging that data. So in the water well database, by analogy, and this would apply to sinkholes or spring location too, a huge effort goes into keeping the location information as good as we can. And so getting data in and out of a database, because location is so important, takes up a huge amount of time. And it's not just one person deciding, okay, that one's in, that one's out. It's agreeing on that location. So the actual implementation of a database requires a lot of attention in terms of data maintenance, sort of mother henning the data. And without that, it doesn't work. So my first problem with a single interstate database is that really managing how the data gets in and out is best handled by the people that are kind of locally doing that data and know those points. To expect to have sort of a gatekeeper for a single database to work won't work, just because it's not really feasible. It's not, especially with issues like location. That would just be one example. So I like the idea, again, as Don mentioned, of keeping in contact, knowing what people are doing, sharing ideas about data structure, but actually getting down to the nuts and bolts of defining those fields that are going to be in a database or out of a database. Again, it's so important, as Don pointed out, in terms of what your application is, that may not always work. The important thing is that the data is accessible. So in a GIS environment, which we're all either in or going towards or developing, that's where we need to communicate so that we're all kind of making sure that our stuff is available. But I would hesitate from backing up to a single database with a single set of fields that somebody has to be able to manage and maintain in one location.
Wow. I agree with everything that everybody said. I'm privileged to have a bunch of smart colleagues who know how to do these things and are doing a good job of it. I am very skeptical that you could put together a four-state Karst Features database, even for the Driftless Area. To spread it out a little bit, it's incredibly, one of the challenges that Karst has had from day one is that everybody wants a simple definition that the lawyers can agree on so that I can build my K-fill, and the whole point is to not to ask the question, should something be here or not, but to simply, what do I have to do what I want to do? And we have to remember that that's what our data is being used for. I was making some notes as we were going through this. One of the things that I would mention is even within what we're calling the Driftless Area, it's the diversity. Monroe County does not look like Door County. Not even close. this side of the Mississippi River doesn't look like that side of the Mississippi River. They're distinctly different. They have different features, they have different characteristics. They have the same kinds of pressures that are going on them, but those are the ones that are dealt with by the government units. And so, again, the philosophy of Wisconsin is not exactly the same. The political philosophy of Wisconsin is not exactly the same as the political philosophy of Minnesota, and vice versa. Those are major issues. The other thing, we're talking about the driftless area, but I would point out that, again, karst is much, much larger than that. In Minnesota, we have a very significant karst in Pine County that's on sandstone, with hundreds, if not thousands, of sinkholes and collapsing sewage lagoons and all the other problems other people have. And the people who do karst are still arguing about is that karst or not. It's an amazingly diverse thing. And so I think each of the states is reacting to what the demands are that they need there. The last thing, I've been looking for sinkholes for 4 decades now, and I feel guilty about it sometimes, because it is only one manifestation of the basic phenomena that we're talking about, which Bob mentioned, about how the water moves through the subsurface. And having these Karst Feature Databases, which I've spent all my career working on, invites people to make a fundamental logic mistake. And that is that if the database doesn't have a spring or a karst feature or a sinkhole on my particular property, that means I'm not in karst. And that is the fundamental mistake that has been made over and over and over, because people want to believe they're not in a karst terrain, because they view that as the analogy that I've used sometimes, and please forgive me, is karst is akin to a social disease. That, you know, if you have some, you don't want anybody to know about it, because it's going to make life more difficult for you. So one of the wonderful things about LiDAR, from my perspective, is I don't have to not go on somebody's property because they got a gun and they'll run me off of it. I can see the whole thing. I mean, what LiDAR has done is given us a first true synoptic view of these things. So we can see it in forests, we can see it on private property that we don't have access to. And I think that is fundamentally changing how we look at these things. And again, if you try to sit down and make a single definition of what something is, then that definition gets built into rules and regulations, and those are incredibly difficult to update as new information comes in. So I think there's a lot of strength in diversity. Questions?
We'll open it up then.
Could the panel comment on agricultural restrictions with sinkholes and karst in the 4 states? I know in Joe Davis County in Illinois, there was a big disagreement with a proposed large dairy animal feeding operation, whether they were being built on karst or not.
Yeah, I was in the middle of that. And the question was, is the area where this proposed CAFO, confined animal feeding operation, was going to go, was it karst? And so I was asked by the Joe Davis County board that whether it was karst, and then so I wrote a short report saying we mapped it in 1996 as karst, and then I explained why there was karst features in the area, and talked about the geology and the hydrogeology. And the State's Attorney General's office contacted me and wanted a bigger report, so I wrote a bigger report. using more words, but essentially the same thing. And they said, oh, that's exactly what we did. So then the people wanting to put in the KFO came in and got some consultant geologists, and they went by the regulations. What's the
Livestock Management Facilities Act.
yes, which Don helped put together, sort of, and so they had regulations as to how to determine if an area is karst, and essentially it included some borings into the soil, and vertical borings, and that was the problem. Doing that, they were going by the regulations, and they said, okay, well, this, the regulations say X, and we did X, and we didn't see anything, and then at some point the State Attorney General's office says, well, you need to look at the karst around the area, maybe you missed something. So they drove around the site and didn't see any losing streams or karst features. They didn't get out of the car either. And, and then they wrote a report on this, 2-page report, and we were reading it, and we're incredulous. It was very disheartening that they would just blow it off the way they did it. So we decided, well, we'll go down and take a look. Maybe we were wrong. And so we looked at the area, and we found sinkholes. We found crevices everywhere, crevices sometimes 3 feet wide, where groundwater was flowing through, and all the indications of a karst area. And so then it went to court, and that was it. And the dairy won. The judge felt that no, it wasn't karst, or we hadn't proven that it was karst. And so that was, and the reason karst was such an issue was because if the area had been karst, it would cost more money to put in the retention lagoons for the manure. They would have had to use concrete and rebar to make instead of a soil-based lagoon, which is compacted clay or local materials. And so the problem with that is that material leaks, so the lagoon would always be leaking. And so with karst, as everybody up here has talked about a little bit, it's about the hydrology, the plumbing. Groundwater flows very quickly through these cracks and create fissures, and so it's easily contaminated, and it goes very fast to outlying wells and that sort of thing. So so basically all we were saying was, yeah, it's karst, and the lawyers were able to prove that it legally wasn't karst. So, and that's where it stood, and then somebody did something on their site, and Matthew Alschuler caught him, and the EPA jumped on him, and then they at some point left and decided to go up to Wisconsin. Sorry. So, any other questions?
Another question? Does somebody else have their hand? One over here. I'd like to follow up. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I just, I've been involved in the Minnesota karst work for a while, and there's been a lot of interest now, at least in southeast Minnesota, from the federal government looking at particularly the river basin, which has got a lot of its karst. And I'm curious if there's been any thought about trying to get, if you're looking for funding, looking at the EPA or NRCS. Some of these federal agencies are very interested in the driftless area. It strikes me as that might be a place to go to get support, funding. I'm not sure any of us want to give, excuse me, I'm not sure any of us want to give up control of our databases to the federal government, but maybe we let a federal agency house this. If any of you thought about that?
The Geological Society annual convention in Vancouver, I approached the National Cave and Karst Institute guys, the president and all that. And I said, what is the availability?
I can't hear you.
We can't hear you.
At GSA this year, I approached the National Cave and Karst Institute leadership there, and I said, what is the availability for funding for karst and cave inventory research, database development? And they said that their budget's been slashed so badly over the last few years that basically nothing, but over the next future few years that they will be able to start awarding grants based on qualifying proposals. I don't have any problem with that. I mean, National Cave and Karst Institute is funded by USGS, and I don't have any problem, going along with their database schema and handing it over to them. And probably updating and loading new data into that database. I don't know about housing that database in Wisconsin, but if they're going to fund it, we'll take the equipment and hire somebody to do that for sure.
I happen to be on the board with NICRI, and they are not funded by the USGS. They're funded by the National Park Service, 1/3, the state of New Mexico 1/3, and the city of Carlsbad for 1/3, roughly. Their budget is small, and we would love to be able to do that, but I don't see it happening in the foreseeable future, but we keep being optimistic. I think what Jeff is talking about is a completely different level of interest. As we were sitting there yesterday listening to talks, and they were talking about how many $100 million worth of money has been spent doing various kinds of soil conservation projects, stream reclamation, and so forth. This is all very applied material, for lack of a word, and nothing in that is, if anything, I'm envious of that level of funding that comes through. Question is, can we tap into anything like that?
Well, it might be Trout, this is sponsored by Trout Unlimited, which has the Driftless Area Restoration, wherever the E stands for, I don't know. Effort, thank you. Trout Unlimited might be the right entity. I don't know, I assume there's Trout Unlimited people here. Trout Unlimited seems to be very good at getting money. And unlike all of us who work for a government agency or a university, they can go twist arms, unlike we can. Maybe it's different in the other states. In Minnesota, I can't go approach a legislator and to start arm twisting, but Trout Unlimited can. They don't have to put the they can take the gloves off and go after funding. So maybe that's a way to pursue this.
Question back.
Well, let me follow up if I could. I think one thing to keep in mind, to ask somebody to manage a data set they didn't generate is, I would argue, dangerous for the long-term health of that data. It's hard enough to keep the data that you generated active and usable over the long haul. So we don't in Illinois have a problem with for example, the USGS managing our data. We try and share data that they're already managing and they're likely to be managing for a while. And so that's just, And another thing would be neat would be maybe to use Trout Unlimited or someone like that to help fund the development of individual databases within the individual states. And again, work towards commonalities that might be effective. But oftentimes, many of the problems that I've been involved with happen within political boundaries. And the bigger the political boundary, the more limiting that is to transboundary needs. And so we've talked about that with geologic maps and at times in other forums, and there really hasn't been the need to share as much data as we conceptually think there might be across state boundaries. It happens occasionally, but they tend to be limited, and until you need to, you don't need to in that sense. So.
I have a interject here. So
Yeah.
the idea of the boundaries, I know in a lot of the areas that we work on in our locality, we're trying to bust past those boundaries and reach over the river, reach over the state for everything. We realize that it makes more sense to function that way. And we've talked about having a centralized database, but I'd like to sort of re-ask the question. I know I've spoken to you about the work done in Australia, emailed some stuff out. What do you think of the idea of, they have the Karst index database where they have all these fields, and you're talking about localized projects and working with them, but in my mind I can imagine this set of fields, and then a particular project just fits into that subset. And so you have everything in the context of the big global picture as it relates to Karst and Karst Feature Data. I think that might help us, people working on political situations or working locally on land use, to better understand where we are in that context, in that spectrum of Karst, and locally to collect data that will fit into that larger database so that it becomes a broader effort to understand this, and that might lead into the political things that we deal with. The more we understand about it and the more everybody agrees, yeah, oh, you're working here, this is where your Karst is, and these are the fields that data is stored in. And if the states did store and maintain their own data, but there was that integration at a higher level. I just wonder, does that resolve some of the questions and issues, and could it get the benefits without the problems by trying to do something like that? That's a good question.
Can I add, I mean, just to clarify, what do you see, what limitations have you run into currently that you couldn't do? What problems weren't you able to solve with the way the data is partitioned? And I'm not saying there aren't, I really do think there can be. I just,
personally,
Yeah.
I was wanting to embark on a local effort to have volunteers collecting data,
Right.
because we live there and might have more access to locations of things and could feed it in. In doing that, I just started to think, if we're going to do it, that's a pretty massive effort, and there are political, ramifications of even thinking about doing that, so you don't do it lightly. If we do it, I would want it to be meaningful at a higher level. I don't want to just do some little thing that we do, and then, like you're talking about, things get lost and shuffled and whatever. And I'd like to have support for us to do it properly, that if there are certain questions you need to ask when you're looking at that thing, what are those questions? And even though you might not decide just look at our data, as something you would use, it would be this layer, where we're there and we can be there and see more maybe not more than LiDAR, but those smaller features or things like that, spring locations we could be helpful with. So, and I think that would help educate us at that level. And we are living there, need to figure out how to live there properly. So that's what I'm reaching for. And I just want what we do to fit into something bigger. And so I was pushing for the regional, but I actually think almost globally there should be some overarching understanding and breakdown of this information. So
We've got a question way in the back.
So I had the pleasure of working with the Geo Survey in Illinois for many years when I was working in state government, and I was always impressed by the fact that what the Geo Surveys had, all of our surveys, could help us in terms of shaping public policy. And I always considered it one of the great secrets in state government that we had these surveys with this incredible amount of information. I want to just pose a question to all of you, and you may or may not have a response to this, but I'm curious, as you look at the data and you see the information that you have in front of you, what are the public policy issues that data could help shape? For example, I noticed on one of the slides you were showing how literally they're shaping how water flows in order to dump it down a sinkhole. And, I'm sitting here thinking, is that a good thing to be doing? Maybe sometimes it is, maybe sometimes it isn't. But whether it's in terms of protecting particular natural resources that are particularly unique, or whether it's dealing with environmental questions, I'm just curious if each of you have thoughts in terms of how could this data help shape public policy, and what should we be thinking about?
Well, I guess currently a lot of the policy ends of things related to Karst are largely related to groundwater quality. And so what you can, given that you're in a very sensitive environment, whether there's a sinkhole there or it's just the very shallow soil cover, over the fractured rocks that will allow water to move very fast and in very confusing kinds of ways. A lot of the public policy thing is, what do you have to do? Do you have to conduct business differently on land with those kinds of characteristics?
And your answer would be probably yes.
And yeah. And some of that is in place. One thing we've been successful at in Iowa, even though there's 20 million, there's a lot more, 6-7 times more hogs than people, but there haven't been any large earthen structures proposed, waste structures proposed anywhere that is in any of those sensitive shallow rock karst settings. That's been pretty much verboten. Maybe that was the gift of the little city of Garnavillo to us when their sewage lagoon popped open. And it left this reminder you could flag around and going, the pork industry doesn't want this to happen to them. You can't let this happen to yourselves. And so they've been fairly supportive of that. On the other hand, half of the impacts that really go on out there, it's just every day-to-day agriculture. And there aren't any special rules on day-to-day row crop production just because you're in a shallow groundwater, a susceptible groundwater environment.
In Illinois, at some point in the 90s, Don put together an aquifer sensitivity map, and that was used quite extensively. And I think he used karst as part of it. And I think, for the most part, if by mapping these areas, by characterizing these areas, we can make it known that there are certain areas that have susceptible aquifers. We also have, buildings. People have built houses in these areas that are collapsing because they're too close to a sinkhole, or their soil is collapsing under their house because it's a karst area. And so we get calls periodically, and saying that their house is collapsing. And we go over and look at the house and say, yes, it's collapsing, and here's why. And and you feel really bad, and there's not much you can do, but you could explain it to them. So one of the things I wanted to do was put out a publication that would be useful to the public, that would define where the karst areas are and what the problems associated with those areas include. And as was mentioned, Bob said, groundwater quality is a big thing. And in southwestern Illinois, where we have 15,000, 20,000 sinkholes, big sinkholes, like hundreds of feet in diameter, it's very mature karst, and the groundwater quality is so bad that people have gone to city water all through, so the pipelines are going through the rural areas, and so people are converting to city water. And so we don't run into the problem of wells that had nitrate concentrations that were 80 milligrams per liter as nitrogen. I mean, it was very bad when we first started working in that area. And so there were in that area there was a public health official that was very proactive, and she was trying to teach everybody about where they were living and what the limitations were, and for example, what would be a bad thing to do, like put in a confined animal feeding operation in a place like that. And so there are regulations that cover some of this, but they need to be updated a bit. And Don's been involved with that. I think I'll tell you a little bit about that. I think.
Well, so I'll follow up with Sam. I think one of the things that this discussion plays out is this, and I commented on earlier, this difference of perspective of what karst is and what the relevance is. And really it's about carbonate bedrock near surface or just carbonate bedrock that maybe once was near surface, and because of that has, by effect of its near surface kind of character for a period of time, all the joints and cracks in it have been widened to some degree, to varying degrees. And really, if we stopped worrying about the land surface expression necessarily, maybe from a policy perspective, getting back to that question, what the geoscientists can bring to bear is the reality that it's about this carbonate bedrock and its proximity to surface. And so based on that proximity to surface, we could really come up with some ranges of land use behavior and recommendations. And when it's within 50 feet of surface, there's a lot of things you really shouldn't do. I mean, a lot of things you really shouldn't do. When it's between 50 and 100 feet, there's a fewer set of things you shouldn't do. But if you're going to excavate down and put a big berm in with a lot of liquids, you know, even 50 feet, if you're excavating 30 to 50 feet, isn't going to be enough. So that's 50 to 100, let's say, and then below 100, there's different types, and below 100 is going to be fairly protected. But that kind of thing would probably be more effective. And when we were dealing back with the LMFA in Illinois, I mean, if you remember those discussions, it was there's competing interests, and there was a lack of understanding, and we were kind of immature at the survey on how to deal with that as a knowledge base at the survey at the time. So our recommendations were kind of limited, but it's again, and maybe we changed the discussion. It's not really about karst on a level from a broad policy perspective. It's about this carbonate bedrock and its close proximity to surface, and from that we can then say, okay, sorry, this has got these carbonates, you know, within 50 feet. You can't put these here, period. You know.
In the state of Wisconsin, that the Northeast Karst test final report did exactly that. It didn't define a set of regulations, they were recommendations. You find a sinkhole on your property, you berm it off, you don't allow spreading within X amount of feet. And that report was vilified. I think more than anything that these databases and maps are to provide information to landowners. Because I've done a fair amount of field work. I've never met a farmer once who was happy about contaminating his neighbor's well. And actually, you know, to the point of tears, many of them. Or killing fish or whatever it is. It's about supplying people with information to make informed decisions, whether it's a farmer or a legislator. As far as CAFO permitting and construction of manure pits in Wisconsin, the NRCS goes and advises people on manure pit construction with the lining, materials, construction techniques, things like that. But as far as land use, that's kind of a zoning thing on a county-by-county basis. And if you don't have any zoning, you're kind of at the will of the landowner, whatever they want to do. You know, you can fight, but in the end, without zoning, it's very difficult to stop someone from doing what they want to, as long as it's not illegal on their property. The other part of that is high-cap well construction. For a large amount of animals, you need a lot of water. And that's kind of a rubber stamp thing in Wisconsin. If you want a high-cap well, they're going to check it out. They're going to tell you how deep you should drill. And as long as the well's constructed correctly, they're going to approve that too. It's an individual basis. It's supplying people with information so that they can make an informed decision instead of public fights later because they didn't have the information they needed to make a sound choice.
Just make a comment from Minnesota that it has been specific to programs. So, for example, large animal feedlots have a less than 50-foot restriction on their construction. This is the first pass for looking at a site. But it's programmatic. So, as Sam pointed out, it doesn't apply or necessarily to row crop agriculture or something else that may be occurring on these landscapes. The database, from a research point of view, and I think the usefulness from a science point of view, would be to try and get at measurements that can actually be made to show the short time span of water getting in the ground and getting out to springs or whatever it is. Just use that data to demonstrate by measuring that this is what's actually going on. You know, the volume of water getting to the ground, again, is not all just going through the sinkholes. The sinkholes are one place where they can get to quickly, but there's a lot more water getting in there and getting out quickly than just going through sinkholes. So, hey, using the database to be able to demonstrate that would be a useful tool in terms of how I see using the data to influence policy.
All that being said, what types of attempts have you made in your different states to contact the people who are in the field then, like the soil and water conservation districts, the land conservation departments, as to all this new mapping that's done and all this new information? Are there, is that information being disseminated?
In Wisconsin, I've personally worked with the NRCS many times, gone out to the field and done geophysics to get exact numbers, interpretation of what's beneath their feet, to build a manure pit or to do whatever, change land use. And we're asked quite often to do that, and we're happy to do it. You know, if it's a one-day thing, it's fantastic. We'll take students out, show them how to use the equipment. So yeah, we're contacted quite a bit to do it, and we're happy to do it.
And I would say it's highly variable. There are a number of people that we know in the various organizations we're talking about who are very receptive to this, who invite us out to make comments and get data to help, who feed us back information about where the sinkholes are and so forth. But there are other individuals in these structures who think we're a complete waste of their time. One of the things I've always found frustrating is the Soil Conservation Service has filled a lot of sinkholes over the years with cost sharing and so forth. And we have never been able to access that information. They treat it as private information, and I mean, it would be nice to know where these sinkholes have been filled. That information has never been systematically. I'm asking my colleagues here, have you encountered that? I mean, do you get any kind of feedback from those kinds of information?
I don't think we do.
No,
Very hard to
I don't
get.
think so.
Yeah.
So, at an individual basis, it works well. At an institutional basis, we're just not on their wave.
I think in Illinois there's an interesting problem in this Livestock Management Facilities Act that kind of set the stage. There was and I don't think we recognized it at the time as much, but there was a statutory conflict put into that, built into that, and the State Geological Survey is statutorily mandated to define, and this is a paraphrase, the geologic framework of the state. Well, in the LMFA in Illinois, the Illinois Department of Agriculture is the one who says whether there's karst there or not, and that was the problem in Joe Davis County, is that Sam at the Geological Survey has been studying this process and understands, again, what karst really means and what its implications are. I was saying, well, it's clearly karst. It's not even a question. I mean, you can't isolate a little part within a big sea of karst and say, well, we're safe. Whereas the Department of Ag was statutory responsible for saying whether it was karst, and they were willing to say, if you drill a borehole to the bedrock surface and you have decided it's not karst, then we're okay with that. And that was what happened. And that, we didn't. I didn't anticipate that.
That might explain why they've never rejected a permit request.
No, completely, completely. And I wonder if that was what was behind some of that lawsuit, because as we built into those regs, what we built in it initially was if it was determined karst, you had to put in a concrete liner to the impoundment and put in one more monitoring well. And my thinking there was then you get a plane, a surface that you could see a slope at least, instead of just 2 points. That was my justification of that. But, that they could have done that and it would have been a slam dunk and it would have been no questions and they met all the rules. But they chose to fight it for some reason, and that is still mystifies me. I don't understand it.
This brings up a critical point, and whenever I try to talk about this, it comes out as I'm being angry and sarcastic, and I'm trying not to be that way. These permits systems are set up very carefully to permit things, not to not permit things. They are not set up to make the decision of whether this should be here or not. They are, at the very best, set up so that you can, people at this table and other regulators can put restrictions on or make it more difficult to do the permit, but they're not fundamentally set up to make the judgment, should this be done here or not. Is that, it's, and that's all of our responsibility in the sense that all of our elected representatives, we have encouraged them to do that. That's how it's kind of set up. One of the observations, 40 years of gray hair brings you some perspective perhaps. You will not win a Joe Davies again the same way. You lost every battle, but you won the war in that case. But it won't work again because they'll change the rules to cover up those holes and so forth. Next time they will drill the one more way.
I thought at that time the simple solution would have been if the regulation is deferred to the survey for that determination rather than.
The legislature, I don't, in my experience, is never ever going to do that. They're not going to turn that control over to a faceless bureaucrats.
It would allow for the updates and the changing science. You've always been in a place where they understood it.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have one. Steve, you've been working with delineation of how water over the surface runs into open holes. What kind of science has been done with the fractures and the cracks that actually don't show up as sinkholes and everything, but they have direct lines. Some of them have direct lines right down into that running water below the surface.
Right. At least in Door County, there's very little land cover. I mean, very little cover over the bedrock. So they're expressed almost exclusively in alfalfa fields. Not every field is alfalfa, so it's difficult, to say the least. Also, the air photos need to be taken at the peak time so you can see these features.
Can I interrupt just a second?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was thinking about that. Karst is not a function of whether or not alfalfa is planted on that field, whether or not it's a dry year. And yet, that's what it takes to have the lines show up. And that doesn't mean that just that field is karst and none of the area around it is karst. And yet, that is how society interprets those observations. And you were talking about Door County. You know about the log den and the brand new restaurant opened, drilled a new well, did everything by the rules. They were trying very hard. Opened 2 weeks later, they had 250 people in the hospital with noroviruses because their own septic system was short-circuiting to their own brand new well. And we were able to do dye traces and DNA testing of the virus, and it was absolutely locked down. The solution to that problem, and it's a very real practical solution, was the restaurant installed a massive water treatment system. They basically took their well water and chlorinated it and ozoned it and ran it through filters and so forth. They got all the ugly stuff out. What we are talking about here is, we keep saying it's the aquifer that's important, it's the water that's important. What we're talking about here is society thinks in much of this country that you can drill a well and drink the water that comes out of the well. And that statement, that belief is getting increasingly at odds with reality. And if we don't change what we're doing on the land surface, and I'm not certain we can, then we're going to have to spend a whole lot more money on water treatment at the individual house scale, or regional water systems, or going to city water in Monroe County, or those sorts of things. That's what's happened in southeastern Minnesota. Basically, since the 80s, it's been illegal to drill a new well into the shallow aquifer, because the assumption is it's contaminated. You have to, rather than spending a few $1,000s to get a new well, you have to spend a few tens of thousands of dollars to get a new well.
So, I mean, this follows out.
And it's gonna go bad.
And one point I was trying to make about the carbonate aquifers, you know, under the ground, we were talking about this last night, below the ground, even people well-meaning, it's really hard to understand what's happening. In most aquifers, they tend to be like, if you think, not like, they tend to be sand deposits that all the water flows in between the sand grains, and that tends to be about maybe 20% of the whole rock volume. In carbonate aquifers, it doesn't usually work that way. It's these cracks. And when the cracks in those, when they're small cracks, it's maybe less than 5%, less than 1% of the volume. And what that means is water moves really fast. I mean, it's the simple way to think it, moves really fast. And if you have more dissolution, more amount of karstification of that system, you have larger channels and it can move a lot faster. And so, I mean, that's the simple way. We know a lot about, to answer your question, we know a lot about how water flows through fractured rocks and dissolved rocks. And the really difficult part about it is, even though there's systematic kind of patterns usually in the fractures, that's general trends, and there's a lot of small fractures you don't see that go in different directions. And you know, you'll have certain zones that, because their makeup, are more fractured than other zones, and so you may have layers within a limestone aquifer that are more heavily karstified, and sometimes below might be more karstified than above, and so it's complicated, and you know, it's just, sometimes it's very complicated, and that's why, as a public policy perspective, it can be helpful to think of these as just very vulnerable, unless we know a lot more about them, and to be very protective of them, and think that they, again, if you put a well in, if they're near surface, maybe we case past that. It means put solid pipe all the way past that upper 50 to 100 feet, so that you're more likely to get into something that's cleaner and away from your septic field effluent, and you might be pulling stuff in that might be cleaner. But it's difficult.
The surface expression of those fractures is just the geologic reality that those rock formations have been there for 400 to 500 million years. And they've gone through a lot, and they are made up and extensively fractured. And that's just the reality.
And the other thing is, when we went into Joe Davis County during the drought of 2012, we were called, and somebody said, well, there's lines that appeared in our fields, and we went out and looked. And we had like a couple of months to capture this information. And so we worked to get IDOT, Illinois Department of Transportation, to fly over it for us and take aerial photographs. And so I flew it with a friend over a lot of the area and took oblique photographs. And then we had that, and then we looked at historic aerial photography, which most on this panel tend to use. And we picked up some of that information from historical photography. And then, for some reason, Google flew that same area in September of that year. And we couldn't find out why, but they flew Joe Davis County. And we were able to pick up all of the crop lines from the alfalfa fields, and got a pattern of fractures from that we could use for a number of things, including a assessment of the karst in that area. You know, how fractured up was the bedrock, and then we looked at road cuts and quarries to figure out apertures and orientations, that sort of thing. But a lot of this stuff is so ephemeral. It's so quick that it's very difficult to capture it. And so what we did it because it was an opportunity. We didn't want to let slip away. And then the publications, the maps we produce, go to state officials as well as libraries, and it goes out to the public. And it in the 1997, 96 publication where we mapped the karst areas of Illinois, that map was used in a lot of regulations to identify where the areas were that were actually karst. and the limitations that are associated with development in Karst.
Our time is up, and we're going to wait for the next session, but I want to thank our panelists for having this conversation.